Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started here in just a moment. Thank you for joining us this evening. And hopefully you can see me. There you are. Okay. So hi, everybody. We're very happy to have you here with us today for this very exciting program. So what I'm going to do is, just as people are filtering in, tell you a little bit about village preservation, tell you a little bit about some context for this wonderful program, and then I'll introduce our lovely presenter and facilitator for tonight, Sydney. So we're very happy to be talking about kind of a moment in preservation history, capturing that moment, and specifically with a graphic novel, which is a really cool way to kind of explore this history. So before we get started, though, I see we have a good amount of people to get started. So I'm going to get into a little bit about village preservation. So I'm Leanne Boutley. I'm the director of programming at Village Preservation, and I'm really glad you're here with us to learn, to share, to grow. And I really encourage us all to be using the chat and communicating with each other throughout this program. And there will be an opportunity to have a discussion with the author. So we'll talk about that in a second. So for right now, let us know where you're calling in from, where you're zooming in from in the chat. Find some connections with the people here. And then also, while you're there, at the bottom of your screen where you find the chat button, you will also find a place where you can do a live transcription. So that's automatically generated. But if you would like that, instead of captions, that is an option. So you can turn that on yourself. So village preservation, we have been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop the inappropriate development in our communities, while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods, and also really supporting small businesses. We host about 75 free programs a year, and we hope you will join us for a future program. Like next week, we'll be going to the Little Missionary Day School in person for a tour and a chat with the current executive director, and talking about the history of Sarah Curry. So that's going to be really fun next Wednesday, the 20th. And then the day after that, on Thursday, we're going to have a webinar with the League of Women Voters to talk about the next primary. Did you know there's another primary coming up in New York State? And that's next month. So we're going to talk with them there. They're both free. Register at villagepreservation.org/events, and I will put that in the chat. Our events cover a wide range of topics, but they're all focused on the deep historical, architectural, and cultural impact of West Village, East Village, and NoHo. And today we're going beyond the village and back to talk a little bit about Penn Station. Our events are designed to highlight how the built space impacts our lives, how preservation is important to all of our communities, and we hope our programs contribute to building a stronger and deeper connection with all of us through the depth and breadth of history and information that we provide. And also we want to highlight the diversity of the lived lives, the lives that are lived in our neighborhoods. We are a member-based organization, so joining us as a member or donating really helps us to continue to provide this free programming. So there's some information here in the chat about that. And you can learn more about us, become a member, donate, volunteer. There's lots of ways to get involved. We do a lot of advocacy, so that's another way to get involved as we're talking about preservation. This is a big thing. So please do get to know us, come back for another program. And also we'll send you an evaluation. So please fill that out and let us know how we're doing, what you'd like to see, all that good stuff. A few Zoom protocols. Start putting those Q&As and those questions in so we can get answers to you. Some of the questions we might hold till the end for the discussion, but some might be answered as we go. So populate that Q&A box, chat with everyone. I see there's some people from all over the place coming in, so that would be great to get to know all of you. I will disappear while Sydney presents, but I will return, and I am looking at our chats and our Q&A. So feel free to ask any questions as we go. So right now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our facilitator today, our speaker, and the author of this lovely book. Sydney Andrea Landers is an emerging historic preservation professional with a passion for equity and preservation, affordable housing, and mid-century design. Currently, Sydney's based in Los Angeles, is working in historic preservation consulting. In the summer of 2021, Sydney interned with the National Trust for Historic Preservation as an affordable housing intern, something we're all talking about a lot right now with New York State, and researching the intersection of affordable housing and historic preservation through the use of rehabilitation tax credits. So maybe we have some questions about that. Sydney holds a Master's of Science in Historic Preservation and a Bachelor's of Art in Art History with a minor in Architectural History and a certificate in Museum Studies. So someone who's really well versed in this. And they're both from the University of Texas, and Sydney's graduate thesis concerns the university housing cooperatives in Ann Arbor, Austin, and Berkeley. So we are thrilled to have Sydney joining us. Sydney, feel free to pop on whenever you're ready. And I'll turn it over to you. Oh, one last thing that I forgot to share with all of you. In preparation for today, I came across this and shared it with Sydney, that the New York Preservation Archive Project is actually celebrating the 60th anniversary of what we'll be discussing tonight. They just posted this to Instagram. So I just thought it was a good reminder of why we're talking about this very important moment in history and how Sydney's work relates very closely to this. So Sydney, I officially turn it over to you now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leanne, for this. And I just want to extend another thank you to Village Preservation for the opportunity to talk with y'all. This is something I didn't imagine happening, so this is really a great opportunity. I'm really thankful. So hi, as Leanne so graciously introduced me, my name is Sydney Andrea Landers. I'm an emerging professional based in Los Angeles currently, and I am going to brief you on AGBANY, a kind of like a love child of mine that I've spent a lot of time with. I made this project while in graduate school as a final assignment for an American architecture class. At the time, my professor, Dr. Tara Dudley, had presented it as an option for the class as like a project medium. And that was kind of a first, I believe, as like a final project assignment. And I knew nearly instantly that I had to pursue it. I've always had a passion for comics and art whenever I was younger, but never thought I could pursue that through the lens of preservation. And as another debrief, in the fall of 2020, I took a supplementary course taught by Kelly Carroll in the New York University SPS school about New York preservation as a whole. And that's how this topic came about. As part of the class, I was doing research on a mid-century church in Harlem, and the architect was Kostas Mashalorizorides. And Kostas was the treasurer of AGBANY. So that was that first seed of inspiration in this. Yeah. You can go to the next slide. Thanks. You can do the next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, so this graphic novel focuses on the efforts of AGBANY, the Action Group for Better Architecture in New York. They were an informal activist group formed by about 25 architects and preservation-minded individuals outraged by the proposed demolition of Penn Station. This group had noteworthy voices such as Mies and Jane Jacobs at their side. While they advocated for Penn Station until its last day, even though they weren't able to save it, a lot of their efforts did become realized through the New York Landmarks Law being signed in 1965, shortly after this demolition. And now it's serving as one of the strongest municipal laws in the country. So that is a tale to tell. So the process of creating the graphic novel started off like any other research project. I went through historic newspapers, photographs, archives. The New York Preservation Archive Project has an oral history collection and transcripts of oral histories for AGBANY key players. So in reading these transcripts from these oral histories, you're able to discover the personalities, the passion, the drive of these key players of the movement, and it kind of humanizes them as individuals, as opposed to being stated simply as like a fact in a research paper. And that's what I found so compelling in the graphic novel, that I was able to kind of like see how these people went about their inspirations, their drive to preserve Penn Station. Yeah, so on this next slide, there are some very preliminary sketches I made while proposing the project to my professor at the time. The work process got a bit unique because I was beginning to process storyboards. So it's a little bit different from like, say, like creating a standard research paper or just doing some standard research. Because you're having to evaluate things such as how many panels do I want per page? How do I want this story to visually flow together? How many pages do I want this to be to fully like flush this out? What kind of visuals do I want to accompany the text? and so on. And then afterwards, I have now since upgraded to very cooler technology, such as an iPad. But at the time, I was working on a 4x4-inch little USB tablet that I would draw onto Photoshop, and that's how the comic came to life in its current iteration. So this entire graphic novel as a whole at a glance, in this next slide, the first 5 chapters are all in a very blue, cool toned color scheme to kind of like signify the events of the past. And when I speak on preservation as a current movement in the last chapter, so like those last 4 pages, it's all in color. So small elements like these, I feel that graphic novels are able to convey these visual mediums subconsciously to like denote a tonal change, perhaps a mood change, for depicting a story of the past that wasn't necessarily successful at the time, but then shifts into a hope for the future of the movement. Let's see. So I wanted to do a very quick reading of chapter 4 for y'all. So it's not necessarily the entire book because I feel like that might be a little too much. But it's a personal favorite because I feel like it exemplifies personally how I see graphic novels can be used to convey certain histories in a visual cinematic way. So this chapter specifically takes into play a quote by Ada Louise Huxtable, an architectural critic at the time. And while her quote already brings certain emotions to a certain person, I feel as though like bringing it into like a visual platform really carries it all the way. Okay, next slide. Oh geez, I'm gonna have to make this bigger. I do not have the eyes for this. Okay, so in January of 1963, the city planning department signed off on the zoning variance and demolition plans, sealing Penn Station's inevitable future. Despite the greatest efforts, AGBANY was unable to stop this tragedy. Demolition was set for October 28th, 1963. During the upcoming months, many documentation efforts were made by world-renowned photographers, filmmakers, you name it. A historic building survey project was conducted at the station, detailing every nook and cranny of its fleeting physicality. On the day of demolition, a small demonstration occurred. 6 members of AGBANY, adored in black armbands of mourning, showed up to the site as their final act of descent. It is rumored that Peter Sampton, one of the founding members of AGBANY, even chained himself to a column that day. Next. The demolition took 3 years. In the words of Ada Louise Huxtable, it is not easy to knock down 9 acres of travertine and granite, 84 Doric columns, a vaulted concourse of extravagant, weighty grandeur, classical splendor modeled after royal Roman baths, rich detail in solid stone, architectural quality and precious materials that set the stamp of excellence on a city. But it can be done. So this chapter, I felt, it's honestly a personal favorite just because I feel as though, so say like paraphrasing something like that and like in a research paper doesn't do it for me really, but like in a graphic novel, you're able to depict basically every layer of peeling back a building back to what it was at the very beginning, which is just pure materials. So yeah. Next. So this may have actually gotten very quickly, but I'm hoping to kind of get into a discussion with y'all with this. So I'm actually self-publishing AGBANY. At the time, my professor had definitely like kind of pushed me to publish. So this summer I'm self-publishing. My first round of pre-orders actually comes in tomorrow. So that's terribly exciting. And I opened up a second round of pre-orders because of extra interest after the first round closed. So that form, which is available through all those kind of links at the bottom, will be open until early August if anyone's interested. Yeah.
Great, and we'll share that link with everyone, Sydney, so people can access it. So this is so fascinating, and I think it's really fantastic, everything you've done with the graphic novel. If people have questions, please bring those in, and I'm going to have some questions for Sydney. So Sydney, I think it's very interesting being a historical preservationist, but working in the present, and as things change so much. So you have a deep understanding of history, but you're also working in the present. Can you talk about kind of that, anything you've kind of discovered in your time looking at the past, but then looking to the future as you consult people on preservation?
Yeah. So right now I'm working in consulting. So it's a lot of like contemporary projects. Say people want to do changes to buildings as we speak. So if anything, looking back on this, it's kind of interesting to think about how I've created such like a love letter to Penn Station through this and the stories that it carries with it, but also working with buildings in the present that sometimes some of these advocacy projects almost feel like a contemporary project that still carries on the same dilemmas as Penn Station, where people are going against demolition, and it still sometimes feels inevitable.
And we have one question came in. Have you thought about doing an animated version or something that's a video version that animates the graphic novel?
That might be a little out of my scope, but I definitely think there could be a very interesting market for that, kind of like animating buildings, or even like, for example, the demolition, like kind of like layers by layers, animating what was taken down first and such like that.
And in your studies, is there anything, because I work at Village Preservation, but I'm new to the preservation side and more the events cultural side. So is there anything in your studies where like that layering takes effect? Like you can take off the first layer, but you can't take off the second layer. Like, are there any kind of complications or anything that you could demonstrate, or you feel like the graphic novel demonstrates with all these materials, how this process actually works? Or what are your kind of thoughts about how you represent this versus the actual work of preservation?
I mean, because this is very early on in the preservation world. I mean, like in the 60s, you get the NHPA and then all of those laws coming into play. So it's interesting to think now that like back then, their only solution was just pure demolition, whereas now it's more to, I mean, there's enough laws for protections now, but there's a lot of more mitigative efforts. So say like they'll preserve like the historic lobby, but then demolish the rest and have interpretive displays as like a mitigation measure. So that's interesting to think about, because I feel like that wasn't necessarily a consideration they had back then, because it was kind of like an all or nothing situation. Because I'm sure if this were to happen now, like it would definitely be much more, even if there was demolition on the table, it would be a lot more mitigative in considering of the history.
Yeah, I sit on my community board in Queens, and we have a historic fire station that needs to come down because it's a long story, I won't get into it. But anyway, it has to come down. And it was interesting because one of the first things we said was like, okay, if it has to come down structurally, whatever, how do we save the bricks, or what are those mitigating factors that we can still preserve? So I think that's a very interesting point that you bring up, that now we're looking at preservation not so much all or nothing, but that there's other ways we can preserve things, and depending on the situation, it might be appropriate or not. A few other questions have come in. What inspired your interest in preservation, and how did you discover the Penn Station story?
So my interest in preservation kind of just came about that I had done my undergraduate in art history and then did a minor in architectural history. So I was already kind of like involved with the architecture school, knew I wanted to pursue architectural history, but I wasn't sure like how to approach it from a more like tactical, practical way. I didn't necessarily want to be writing like research papers, and like while academia has its values, I wasn't sure if that was the route I wanted to take. So then also conjuncturally at the same time, I was working at the Starbucks across from the architecture building at my university, and then all my regulars at the time were architecture professors. So I talked to them about like my courses and such, and found out that my the preservation director was a regular who would come for coffee 3 times a day. So then we started talking about preservation 3 times a day. And from there, I was basically recruited into the program, but I knew that I wanted to work in something that involved stewardship of buildings, care for buildings into future generations, and then kind of got into preservation from there. Yeah. And then Penn Station, I feel like it's a very like common story, like it's like a great preservation legend that everyone just kind of inherently knows, I feel. And then I think it was just because whenever I was taking the NYU class, I got into like a research rabbit hole with AGBANY and trying to figure out what that all was about, because I'd never heard about anything like a preservation advocacy group like all the way back then.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. And we have a couple other questions, but I have a question for you too, that as someone who's like kind of in the next generation of preservation, what is that like, entering something that's so historical that there might be a generational gap? Have you found that? Are there any things that like in your training are coming up for you all coming up that is different from what your training is? Or are there any things you're finding as a emerging preservationist that surprises you?
Yeah, I feel as though I definitely think there's a lot of change in the movement currently happening already by individuals. There is definitely like there probably is like a pretty big like ideological gap, but I feel like a lot of people are making efforts to kind of like bridge that. There's already movement on like salary transparency done by a wonderful colleague, Sarah Marsom, that's been done. And I feel like the people of like my generation are kind of pushing preservation to bounds they haven't really wanted to consider yet, which I'm very excited about. So
that's super exciting. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to have you here, is that I think it's important for all of us to have that intergenerational kind of conversation about preservation, that it's not just people or younger people, it's all of us kind of working together for this. And I'm going to share, Bruce shared a comment, the blue-gray wash gives it the feel I experienced being a kid in the station, and goes to the Grand Central Terminal Concourse because it has that aural impact, the space and the people all at once. So I don't know, do you have a reaction to someone's reaction to your graphic novel?
Yeah, I could definitely see that. I just wanted to give it kind of like a sense of like almost like a somber tone, but also like a nostalgia, that kind of tone. Yeah.
It's funny. I think of blue when I think of Penn Station. I don't know why, but it's very apt.
Yeah, I could like the cool tones of like the columns and such like that. I could see that. I just wanted to go back to kind of just like understanding how kind of where preservation's going. Just another thing I feel like I've noticed, because I graduated last May, so I've been in like the workforce and consulting for like the past year now. And it's interesting because I've met so many people that are like at so many layers of this, starting from people starting National Register nominations right when National Register was a thing, and seeing how even things like that, how National Register was so sparse to begin with, and now it's such a very in-depth active love. So like kind of just seeing that, I feel like there are benefits to say like younger generations coming into preservation because they don't have preconceptions of what the field should look like. So then they're going at these things and going, why is it like this? Like, do we really need to do it like this anymore? Like, can we change that? So yeah, it's very hopeful.
Yeah, and I think it's really cool that we now have another, well, it's not cool, but there's an interesting convergence that we have another Penn Station discussion going on with the current talk about Penn Station. Do you have any, someone's had a question with the redevelopment controversy, how it compares or contrasts to the previous one?
I feel like I don't want to like put like my own like expressed opinion on it because I don't live in New York and I don't feel like I have like a valid reason to have an opinion on this. But I do find it interesting just because it's the same conversation, but people have different conceptions on it now because they thought, oh, because this one demolished something historic, this one inherently can't be a historic without considering it on its own right, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, and of course we have the Landmark Preservation Commission now, which they didn't have before. This helped kind of lead to that. I think housing is a big issue right now, and I wonder if you have any insights from your work in housing, just in general, anything that you'd like to share from your research. Again, not opinions or anything, but just like observations about where your research kind of led you, or if there were any conclusions that you or the organization you were interning with came to.
Yeah, so like I did my thesis as kind of an extension on affordable housing, but it was on university housing co-ops, which I benefited from while I was an undergraduate, which are all like they're all inherently historic because the organizations are inherently historic, but these are very like dense, like single family houses that accommodate maybe 20 to 25 undergraduate students that could have been kind of like subdivided on the interior for very affordable prices. And then also whenever I was at the trust last summer, I was doing research on how there's affordable housing provisions in select in select state historic tax credits. So say they'll give them more historic tax credits if they include affordable housing. So in that research also, it was just kind of like, I do see a lot of benefit in historic buildings being utilized for affordable housing because they're already there, you know? So why not? Like, what you wouldn't want to leave them to waste, right? So yeah.
Yeah, and someone brought up interesting, and again, this is not a commentary, but just the issue of underuse of the station might have been previously, where now it might be overuse of the station, and the changing demographics changes how we're thinking about preservation, I think. And you already brought up the point, is it preservation? Because how historical is it? How old is it? You know, all those things are considerations. And another question, well, another person had a comment how this kind of reminds them of the superimposing that was happening in the new West Side Story. And I don't know, Bruce, if you mean, I can't remember if you mean the stage version or the movie, because I've seen both and I can't remember which one used the superimposition. But I thought it was very interesting in both, seeing like it really like hit home that this was happening to build Lincoln Center. It was very clear that like this was happening in a space where then Lincoln Center went up and connected those two things. Are there any other kind of things in art that inspired you to think about doing a graphic novel, or that since you've done the graphic novel you see and you're like, oh wow, that's an interesting way to represent something? How has doing the graphic novel made you look at kind of other art and culture in a way that serves your career?
If anything, it's made me, at least from like an artistic standpoint, made me consider like, how would you depict this visually? So like say it's just like a narrative or like a quote or something like that. I'm like, how can you like depict this visually in a very like cohesive manner? But also there are a lot of history-based graphic novels that are already out there that are very popular, but I hadn't seen one from like a preservation standpoint. So there was one on Robert Moses that I had read, and I used it like as almost like more so artistic inspiration to see how they like went about doing that. But definitely history graphic novels were a huge inspiration as well.
That's so cool. And are there any other preservation topics or sites that you would be interested in doing a treatment like this too, or something that piques your interest for the future?
Well, I haven't said this out loud yet, but like I'm thinking, or because I've been thinking about like my next like venture in relation to this, because I really liked where I left AGBANY, like because it's kind of a short chronicle, to say the least. But my next like venture, I've been considering looking into the Mount Vernon ladies, because it's another preservation advocacy work group, but very much older, and it's got women's history incorporated into it. That's definitely going to be a much larger and longer venture, but yeah.
And so women's history kind of drew you to that. Any insights before you've done the research that makes you kind of interested in that period, or something that particular aspect of their work that you might want to highlight?
I honestly just kind of digging into the people behind it. So like it was interesting, like listening to all the oral histories for all the individuals related to AGBANY. And I do want to kind of like see the inspirations, the drive of the women behind Mount Vernon. So that could be very interesting.
That's great. And someone asked, do you think the graphic novel platform can effectively reach maybe previous untapped groups or groups that are not currently interested in preservation, maybe underrepresented groups or minority groups, or anyone who hasn't been interested previously?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like graphic novels are very much a more accessible platform per se. Just because like I feel like research papers or even like other platforms can be a little bit more daunting for people not in the field, but a graphic novel is visual and it's not getting into too many nitty-gritty details about every like what exact plaster was used for a matter. It's like a generic larger story chronology that I think can be more digestible to a larger crowd. And like even myself, like I've been able to share this with family members or friends that are not necessarily in the field. Like for example, my grandmother like doesn't really speak like that much English, but like she can look at pictures and be like, wow, that's really cool that you did this. Like, yeah.
I think that's really cool, the part of sharing your work with others, because I think a lot of people in fields like preservation, I've worked mostly in the nonprofit field my whole life. And so my whole life since I started working. But so I think sometimes it's hard to capture what we all do in our work.
Yeah.
So that's a really cool way to attract people, not only just to like supporting preservation and learning about it, but maybe becoming a preservationist. I always say, like, as a young kid, I didn't think I'd be doing adult educate. Like no one was like, I want to be an adult educator when I grow up, you know, and there's all these different fields that are really cool. And so this could be a cool way to let people know you can go into this as a field. Look at Sydney, she's doing it herself.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a lot of benefits to that. In the writing process, it honestly reminded me because I've worked with museums in art museums and like public history, small town, literally my hometown museum, and writing, just like doing my research with all these like primary sources and then kind of dialing it down to text that couldn't be presented in a graphic novel. It was kind of interesting because it reminded me a lot of like interpretive displays and kind of making sure that language is accessible to everyone and it's not like lines and lines of text and somewhere it doesn't fit, right? Yeah.
That's interesting. And can you talk a little bit more about like interpretive displays that you've encountered? And I think that's an interesting way to think about history and preservation, is how do you access it? Like if you're in a museum, how are you taking in what you're seeing? So any insights from your work so far about those kinds of installations and how that works?
Yeah, it's just more so like making sure that you're like conveying the larger story without getting bogged down in the details. And then just kind of like language choice, which was an interesting one, and like trying to make sure that it was also something that was like retaining interest and something that made it seem like a narrative book, but also wasn't too bogged down. Because I mean, I would be interested in the preservation stuff, but someone maybe not in the field would be like, why are they talking about this? So yeah, it's kind of interesting to think about because I in the past I worked with interpretive stuff for like say like a fifth grade class tour group, or like an interpretive plaque for like an art museum where like college students are passing by, and they're very different audiences, so it's kind of have to play to it. So this one was kind of interesting because I was doing it in grad school, and like it was for a grad school like class, but at the same time, like I felt like because of the medium it was, I felt like it still had like to be like dialed down to a more like digestible level.
And I think it's very interesting. It almost read like not a necessarily a thriller, but like I was excited to get to the end to find out what was going to happen, even though we know from history. But was there any thought in the digestibility of having that kind of feeling of what's going to happen next?
Yeah, definitely. I feel
Are you
like
a mystery writer in disguise?
I honestly really, really don't like being surprised. So like, I don't know if that would happen. Yeah, but like, that was the end goal in this kind of thing. Just because I feel like graphic novels, like I feel like they have to be engaging. You have to engage your audience. It has to be fun and exciting because that's the whole point of the medium. Like, and that's why whenever this was presented as an option, that was like my first instinct to think about, because I thought Penn Station, whenever I was reading all of the like research rabbit hole, like 3 a.m., just like getting deep into the lives of these people from AGBANY, like it was just so interesting that it felt like that to me. So I was like, what better way to do that than put it into that kind of medium?
And can you talk about any inspiration you found in the research in AGBANY, either in your current work or like thinking about your career, anything that you kind of took from the stories of these, and you're hearing their oral histories, anything you've taken away from that for your own personal kind of work in preservation?
If anything, I will say the funniest thing is that like trains follow me no matter where I go. So like my very first internship in the field was for a small train museum in my hometown, that I frequented as a child on tours in elementary school. And it was all like electric railway, historic trains. It was in a historic train depot station. And then AGBANY happened with Penn Station, and then my firm right now is the on-call consultant for Union Station. So they're everywhere. Which is
That's so
quite funny because
cool.
I feel like there's people who actually specialize in trains.
Yeah.
And I feel like they've just inherently followed me everywhere I go.
That's great. And so what, as if you could speak to kind of as an emerging preservationist, you've gone through your schooling, you're done with your thesis, or you're done with your thesis, right?
Very done with it. Very done.
Very done with the thesis.
Yeah,
Done
I
with the
finished last night.
thesis. Oh, that's right, last night. So done with the thesis, you're in the field. What if someone like my little niece comes up to me and is like, what does Sydney do? How do I do what Sydney does? What would be a few things you would say to someone kind of thinking about going into this who hasn't started yet?
Honestly, I feel like it all just kind of like came about very naturally, just because I was already in the history field. So like with architectural history, I started going to like historic homes tours and such like that in like the area, or I'd like start going to like the city. Like at the time when I was in Austin, it was Preservation Austin, I would go to like the nonprofit organizations and events like that. I got involved with like the university graduate like professional group for preservationists. So kind of just like inserting my way into all these places. And then I feel like with that inherently, I just like heard about like internship opportunities and kind of just poked my head in different like levels of things like a museum or like a nonprofit and such. Yeah, and then I just kind of figured out maybe I don't know my niche, but like what I wanted to do within that.
That's excellent. And I didn't even pay Sydney to say that, everyone, because what I think it comes down to is that's why we do what we do at Village Preservation, to have these sorts of programs. And we have our kids ed program and things like that, so people are exposed to this. I think, I always say I have a deep love of libraries. It's because my local public library was someplace my mother brought me to all of the time, and they had great programs that we participated in. So having a local train museum, being able to go to these lectures and things, that I think that proves that it's important for organizations like Village Preservation and others to be doing this programming so people of any generation are interested in continuing it. It sounds like, did that have a big influence on you? These different kind of programs you were able to do?
I feel like preservation is a very, very local field. Like you have to very much know your community. So that's very much one thing. Like if you want to get into it, you actually have to like meet people in the field and the organizations kind of to like figure it out. And that's why like I feel like AGBANY was a little bit interesting just because like I had but when I was in grad school, like I had my heart like set on like moving to New York and such like that. So then I had like this project and I took the NYU course and I was like trying to like insert my way into there. And then I ended up in LA by chance, which has been good. But it's almost kind of like that you have to like put yourself into the local community to like figure it out.
I mean, that makes so much sense, and it just makes so much sense in the advocacy work we do. I mean, you even said from the beginning, like, I don't know if I can comment on Penn Station because I don't live there, and I think
yeah, you know, that I feel like it's a very local thing. Yeah.
So I think the local interaction is a really interesting part of what you're saying, and that now that you've been like the two coasts and also in Texas, do you see any regional differences in the approach to preservation? Is it everyone's the same? Is there something you can kind of speak to in terms of when you go into these local communities, do you see differences, similarities?
I mean, I feel like there's inherently differences just from like local laws and such like that. But like in a general scope, I feel like it's all just like an endearing love for like place and history, however that comes about. And that's been very kind of promising and hopeful to look at, that regardless of what kind of like circumstances or like what kind of protections buildings may have in different areas regionally, like there's still like an ongoing like hope in it for their futures, which is inspiring.
Yeah, I love what you just said. We have to quote you, Sydney, that an enduring, what was it? An enduring love.
It's like an enduring love and hope and like passion for these buildings, that people just want them to see light into the future.
Yeah, and I think that's so interesting. We talk a lot about the divided nation and everything, and having been in these three very distinct places in the country to come away with something so hopeful and uniting is very interesting.
Yeah.
So Jason asked, does LA have a strong preservation movement? And we can make it less opiniony, and you can speak to kind of what the protections are and how are the laws maybe different in LA, or are there a lot of organizations?
I feel like, I mean, it's probably one of the reasons why I probably end up here, that there's a lot more market for preservation in California because of the California Environmental Quality Act, which basically puts into place a lot of protections for buildings, historic buildings through that, meaning there's a lot more work for people like me, like consultants. But it's been interesting because I feel like even say like in consulting, even in like the saddest situations where like there is like an HRA and like a building's like not deemed historic or whatnot, the act of the HRA, like a historic resource assessment, it's almost like an act of love, like setting it to bed, and that's always been, even in like the most bleak situations, I still see an attention to detail and love, which is quite interesting. And maybe it's a little like too optimistic, but
no, I think that's great. I mean, could you say that again? Someone said case study houses. What was it that you were saying the study is called?
Oh, no, there's case study houses in Los Angeles, which are absolutely beautiful. Yeah, I haven't been able to work on any, but they're very beautiful.
That's cool. And I think it's also interesting to tie, I mean, this is a very generic thought that is not based in research, but interesting how the environmental laws in California impact preservation, whereas in New York, it might be environmental laws, but it might be just the history of things like AGBANY, not going to be able to say it, but the history of preservation in New York, we have like the Landmarks Preservation Commission and things like that. So in that kind of regional thing, do you see people approaching preservation from like a very local, what people care about locally? Do you see that kind of shade how people approach preservation?
I think it's still very much like a local effort. Like even in Texas, like there isn't really much environmental protection. And it's been like even in Texas, like there is just like a local effort for history. Like you have your local history organizations, like your certified local governments. And you have some very involved individuals who very much love where they're from and their history, which will dedicate literally, like even if they're retired, they're like dedicate like a full 40 hours a week to uncovering the history of theirs, of their towns and such. So I feel like even despite whatever laws and regulations there are, like you still find those individuals everywhere you go.
And that's so interesting to me that it's so grassroots still, even in New York, LA, and Texas, like all these different geographic locations, there's still this grassroots element. This is an opinion question. Do you think that could ever be extricated from the local? Or, I mean, we've talked a lot about locality and being local and how that impacts things.
Even because I mean, there's like national organizations like the National Trust that I worked with last summer. And even what they do is still somewhat grassroots because they have like field offices and such like that. But like, I feel like you can't take preservation away from that when it's such a local thing. Because like, we're concerning buildings, like a census place. You can't kind of like generalize that, if that makes sense. Like each building has its own preservation advocacy, like fight per se. So
and we talk I mean, in preservation, what I know so far, we talk a lot about the kind of look of a community, of what is consistent, what is inconsistent, and that can't be done on a national level because it is so individualized to the local community. So that's so interesting. Are you familiar at all with the Los Angeles River efforts or the River Walk in San Antonio?
I haven't gotten involved with those, so I don't want to like say anything.
Yeah. That's okay.
Yeah, but like it's been, I mean, that's why I think I find preservation so endearing because it's such a community-based thing too, that you have to, it's like an act of love. You have to be involved with your community, but like because it's a sense of place, like you are with you have to be involved. It's not like you can like do this from very afar. I mean, like you can now in the world to telework, but still.
Yeah, I was going to ask, did that impact things? Because we're talking about local so much and love and all these things. Did that impact your work at all when things had to go remote? I mean, you were kind of transitioning, so you might have not.
Yeah, I was like already a year into grad school I was already like a year into COVID and like 2 years into grad school by the time AGBANY happened. So that really wasn't too much of an issue. And if anything, it's probably made my life a lot easier in trying to communicate with individuals, say like in New York or just like even in the like, because I'm self-publishing, I'm having to do everything myself. So like in the marketing campaign, if you want to call it that, of the graphic novel, it's made things a lot easier because people actually respond to their emails. So yeah,
that's great. And yeah, because they're actually looking at their emails because we're all remote. That's so cool. And what I kind of want to finish with, but we have time, if there's more questions, if people want to lob them to us. But one thing I wanted to ask is about that self-publishing kind of process, because I wonder, it's different than an academic publishing sort of thing. How are you finding it? Any tips for anyone from what you've learned from doing this? And are you willing to do it again? It sounds like you might be, but.
Yeah, honestly, I do like it a lot because I have control of the entire process. And I don't really have to compromise anything about the graphic novel to a publisher per se. So, because I remember last summer I had sent like like, I can't even count how many proposals to like different publishers. And then from the university perspective, they didn't want to publish it because it was a graphic novel and they focus on research paper. And then the graphic novel publishers were like, we don't want to publish this because it's too history based. So self-publishing it has been a lot more interesting just because I'm able to like learn every part of the process. So like setting up like a pre-order form and like figuring out a printer, like figuring out the printer and like even just figuring out how to like make something printable into a book format has been very interesting. And yeah, I think it's been a huge learning process, but I'm very grateful for it, just to have kind of like something to like use as like aspirational to like learn in this process. And then also my first round of copies come in tomorrow apparently, so I'm very, very excited for that, to actually like hold a physical copy of something that like I spent my last month of graduate school kind of like laboring over this. So it's kind of interesting to finally be able to see this in physical copy, so terribly excited for that.
That is so exciting. And I think it's so interesting, the parallel between a group that decided to do something new and do something their own way, and the kind of waves it took is the topic of your book. And then what you're doing is something new. And that people didn't really think about, like, oh, well, it's not researchy enough, or it's too researchy for the two places. So you're finding your own path. I think that's an interesting parallel.
Yeah, I think it's like the epitome of like, whatever, I'll do it regardless. Which I feel like it was the efforts of AGBANY, because I know they had made some efforts to like get like, I mean, they did their like press releases and all that kind of stuff, and it was very much like a DIY effort. And I'm a huge fan of that kind of effort, that kind of work. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful note to end on, just kind of the parallel there between the topic and the group that you studied, and then your own work to make this a reality. And Sydney, I definitely want to see a picture on social media or something of you holding a copy of your
I'll
book
definitely
there.
be posting that on my handy little Instagram handle that's at the bottom, Squidney Comics, or as a Peloton instructor called me out once and said Squid NY Comics, which is a little handed towards AGBANY. So yeah.
That's great. Well, and for everyone who's still with us, there are a couple other programs coming up, so please feel free to register. We will send you a follow-up email, which will have the links to Sydney's information, as well as a survey that we would love for you to fill out. And yeah, I just think this was a fascinating conversation, Sydney. And the book, I mean, I just fell in love with it the minute I found it once you sent it to us, because I think it's very endearing and very clear. The labor of love aspect that you keep bringing up, I think, is very clear in this, and it is a point of inspiration. I think we all know, whatever our political background, we all know there's a lot going on right now. Yeah. So I think to go back in history and see a group of people who came together and did something is inspiring, especially as we have these fights, as already mentioned, continue in our city and across the country. Any last thoughts you'd like to share with everybody?
Yeah, I just want to kind of piggyback on that. I've been thinking about that a lot, just kind of like trying to see my place in preservation, coming from working in nonprofits, working in museums, working in consulting now for the foreseeable future, and kind of seeing that regardless, preservation is an act of love, and I would like to consider myself a lover of buildings. So
I think we have multiple great Sydney quotes after today, and a lover of buildings is a great one. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, everyone. Now the numbers are going back up. I don't know what happened, but hey, y'all, we have time for one more question if anyone has any, but otherwise, just deep gratitude for your work, Sydney. Keep us informed as you go through your career. We might have a panel coming up on building a career in preservation, and it would be great to have you come back and chat with us about that.
Yeah. Wonderful. Sounds great.
Thank you. Great. Well, thank you all for joining us. We appreciate your lovely feedback, lots of kind words in the chat box, and we'll see you at the next one. Thank you so much, Sydney.